Hey everyone, Pastor George here with today's Bible study recap. And today in Bible study, we looked at Esther chapter 6, which really to me serves as the point where we can talk about the composition of Esther. So you'll remember on Sunday in kind of my introductory sermon where I talked about the major theme of how God is aware and working in the book of Esther, even though he's never mentioned. Chapter 6 is the point in the narrative where you see these reversals begin to take place, and the entire you can kind of think of the narrative of Esther being like a horseshoe, right, where they have lots of mirrors on the sides of each other that lead to chapter 6 kind of being in the middle, and then you kind of see it. So for instance, in chapters 1 and 2 you have the king of Persia's greatness and Esther and Mordecai saving the king. And in 9 and 10, you have Mordecai's greatness and Esther and Mordecai saving the Jews. And then in beginning of 3, you have Haman being elevated. And in the beginning, the end of 8, you have Mordecai elevated. Then you have the decrees. You have in the middle of 3, you have Haman's decree. In the middle of chapter 8, you have Mordecai's decree. And then in chapter 4, you have Esther and Mordecai planning, which is in the beginning of chapter 8. So you have the similarities there. And then in chapters 5 and 7, you have the banquets that Esther holds, the first and second banquets. And it leads down to chapter 6, right? So 6 is kind of the center point in the narrative, but also in the narrative structure of the book of Esther. And so we talked a little bit about that this morning, but really we also just did a deep dive in 6 because one of the big important themes, I talked about this on Sunday, right, is that in the book of Esther, there seems to be lots of coincidences. The best example of this is Esther being chosen as queen, kind of the thing that leads on to it. Why did she have to be chosen, right? Oftentimes we would chalk these things up into chance, luck, coincidence, right? Or that Esther just happened to overhear these guards and warned Mordecai about it. These guards who were going to assassinate the king warned Mordecai and the king is saved, right? Why did Esther have to hear it? This is because in the story there is a lot of coincidences, and this gets you to the main theme of the book of Esther, which is God is working even when we don't necessarily see him at work, right? So this is kind of the biggest and kind of funniest coincidence that happens in the book of Esther, because there's quite a bit of a comedy in here, and you can see this in chapter 6. So Haman, right, the guy who's been trying to kill Mordecai, he has the decree made where the Jews are going to be killed on a certain day, right? They roll a dice called a pur. That's where Purim comes from, the Jewish celebration of the book of Esther, right? They roll a dice and it falls on a certain day. And so our narrative today begins with is the king can't sleep. He can't sleep, so what he does is he has the royal records read to him, and he's reminded about how Mordecai saved him, but that he didn't get anything. And just at that moment, right, Haman is coming in. This probably means it's early morning because there's an earlier dialogue he has where his wife tells him to go to the king in the morning. So it's probably the morning of what this is happening, right? And so king brings Haman in and he asks him, what would you do for someone like this? If you wanted to honor someone, and Haman thinks he's going to be the one who's going to be honored. So he asks for everything that he would want, right? He asks to be treated like the king. He wants the king's clothes. He wants the king's horse. He wants the nobles of the city to go around and announce his presence to the people, and everyone is going to think he's awesome, right? That's what Haman thinks is going to happen. And then the king goes, that's a great idea. All right, go and do that for Mordecai, right? So he makes Haman go and do this. And of course, Mordecai and Haman are enemies. So there's this great irony and shame that comes with Haman having to lead Mordecai dressed as the king around the city, proclaiming how awesome he is to everyone. And then he comes back to his house and he's talking with his wife and with other people conspiring against Mordecai. And they say something pretty interesting to him. They say that because you have tried to do this, if Mordecai, before you whom have begun to fall is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him, but you will surely fall before him. That's what they tell him, right? And that there's a little irony in what they're saying, right? That word in Hebrew, nafal, or Nepal, depending on whether it's a pa or fa, is a word that means to fall, but it's also used to cast, like to throw a dice. And so that's the word that's used earlier when Haman throws the dice to determine when the Jews are going to die. So you have this word pop up again here. And another time in Esther's narrative where you can see it kind of being ironically used, right? Things are falling into place, seemingly. But what's happening, right, is God is working under the surface. And so that's what we talked about today, and it's a good reminder as you continue to read the book of Esther to see God in the details, and not only in the book of Esther, but in your life as well. So I hope you guys found that interesting, and I will see you tomorrow for an episode of A New Thing. Peace out.